Hi, hello. We are back in our series on Syria. We are now in chapter or episode number 7, and we are continuing with what we started in the previous episodes about Syria and Israel. And I told you about the beginning of the peace talks between Israel and Syria, which was a big event, and I explained very briefly why. But let me get more into that, and then we'll see about the results of this talks that prove to be futile and how they are leading us to understanding the current situation between Israel and Syria and what could be the immediate future or medium-term implications of the current situation. We have to know that in Israel, the name of Syria has always been the name associated with a very militant, hateful, aggressive Arab country against Israel, even though the greatest danger to Israel's security, at least until 1973, the Yom Kippur War, which was a very significant war, was from Egypt, first presented by Abdel Nasser, the famous ruler of Egypt and the leader of Pan-Arab movement, and later on in the Yom Kippur War, 1973, by Anwar Sadat, who later made peace with Israel, but that's about Egypt and Israel, so it's another topic. Syria has always been associated with being a brutal country, the attitude towards Syrian Jews. And I remember, and you should remember that I mentioned in the previous episode how the Israeli delegation for the first session of the peace talks between Israel and Syria in 1991 raised the question of Syrian Jews as the first question on the agenda because it was so important to Israelis. Also, the treatment of Israeli prisoners of war in Syria was always brutal. The hanging in public and the humiliating death of the famous Israeli spy Eli Cohen that was caught by the Syrians. Well, obviously, the Syrians had the right to try him, to judge him, and we all regretted what happened to him, but not allowing to this very day his remains to be brought to Israel, to be buried there, added up to the sense in Israel that we deal here with a very, very aggressive, brutal, hateful Arab country. And of course, the Syrians were always very keen on promoting this image of Syria being the center of Arabism, as they say in Arabic, and I mentioned this expression before, Qalbul Uruba, the heart of Arabism. So therefore, the very talks that we had with Syria in 1991 that lasted intermittently with stoppages, with breaks, with lulls until 2009, or even maybe more than that, 2011, the very fact that we had these peace talks, therefore, was a big break. And one could argue, look, if Syria joins the peace process, so the fact of the matter is, and I explained it, that both sides in 1991 did not have the real interest to go beyond the talks themselves for the sake of having talks and having a solution. But you have to bear in mind that the Israeli considerations as to why to continue with peace talks with Syria for as long as it took, even after the initial failure of the first round of talks in 1991, 1992, in which, by the way, I personally participated, as I already mentioned, was the sense that Syria was stable. And Israeli governments, successive governments of both Labour and most of the time Likud, they really did believe that the Assad regime was there to stay. And they based their assumptions on a variety of considerations. Chief among them, by the way, was the sense that so long as Syria was stable, there was also a peaceful, quiet border between the two countries. Maybe even the quietest border of Israel was the border with Syria after 1973-74, the Yom Kippur War. The border between Israel and Syria became very peaceful. But it wasn't really as it seemed to be. It wasn't. It was an optical mistake because Syria continued to be the harbinger of terrorism against Israel by supporting Palestinian terror groups, by supporting their own version of Palestinian group. It was called Asaika, which was basically the Palestinian section of the Syrian Ba'ath Party. And in line with Ba'ath ideology, the Al-Saika people didn't even make bones about the fact that they were not acting as a Palestinian group in support of the Palestinian struggle, but as a Syrian pan-Arab nationalist group because the question of Palestine was a pan-Arab issue. By the way, historically speaking, Syria has always been involved in the struggle of Palestinian Arabs against the Jews, the Israelis after establishment of Israel, but before the Zionist movement in the land of Israel, Eretz Israel or Palestine. The famous weapon used by the Hamas organization, the Qassam rockets, the name of their military units, the Qassam brigades, was after the name of this famous Syrian Sheikh Azz-ad-Din al-Qassam, who invaded Palestine in 1935 and was killed by the British at that time and became a national hero. So the Syrians supported Palestinian terrorism against Israel. Then they supported, of course, the anti-Israel groups in Lebanon. In the war of 1982, when Israel invaded Lebanon, there was a collision between the two armies. The Israelis were the initiating side of this collision, by the way. The Syrians did not want to get into war with Israel at that time. And interestingly enough, they published a very, very significant announcement by the Ba'ath Party some days after the beginning of the war in 1982, in which they explained from an ideological perspective why they could not get into the war with Israel at that time. And I'll mention something ideological about the Syrian position justifying either going to war with Israel or not, the way they explained it ideologically, because that was very significant to understand about Syria, the domination of the Ba'ath Party, the ideological, political umbrella of legitimacy for the regime. It was basically a regime of a minority sect, the Alawis, but under the banner of the Ba'ath Party. When in 1990, the Soviet Union was in the process of collapse, beginning of 1991, Hafez al-Assad gave one of his big speeches in which he explained that he understood the changes in the world. And therefore, what could be the lesson for Syria? It was very interesting. Hafez al-Assad was very, very rigid ideologically in theory, but in practice, he maintained this regime of stability along the border with Israel after 1974, tried to evade at all costs the war in 1982, even though he would later support Hezbollah against Israel until the Israeli withdrawal in the year 2000 from Lebanon, but entered the peace talks in 1991 after he realized that the Soviet Union, his erstwhile huge umbrella, would not be there for him anymore. It was in May of 1991 when the Israeli government at that time got the clear signals that the Syrians will enter peace talks, not with the aim of achieving peace, but with the aim of diffusing tensions alongside with the desire of Hafez al-Assad to look good in the eyes of the US. And that was in May of 1991 when the Israeli Prime Minister at that time, Mr. Shamir, and I was one of his advisors, I was around, I knew, I saw, understood that we are going to have talks with Syria. So we have time, we have had time at that time to prepare for those talks. We started only in November. And as I said, they were futile, and I explained before why. All the other rounds of talks with Syria from 1991 until 2011, with different Israeli prime ministers and governments, were based on the assumption that this was a stable regime. And Israeli intelligence and Israeli politicians did not accept the idea that it was a minoritarian regime that was somehow illegitimate and in one way or another might have been doomed to collapse under different circumstances, I should say. So whenever Israelis criticize Western intelligence services and countries for not understanding the Middle East, for not realizing what's happening really underneath the undercurrent situations in Arab countries, the truth of the matter is the Israelis also are prone for that mistake. Hafez Assad's regime and then Bashar Assad seemed to be very stable. But then came the civil war in 2011. And even then, it wasn't clear in Israel what would be the result. By the way, it wasn't clear in other countries. 2 or 3 weeks after the beginning of the troubles in Syria, Then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said, oh, don't worry about Bashar Assad. He is a reformer. He will take care of the situation. On the other hand, the then Israeli Defense Minister Ehud Barak made a comment that the regime will collapse very quickly. So that was a departure from traditional sense that, this was a stable regime. That was a big departure. But he proved wrong, Ehud Barak, Hillary Clinton proved wrong. But there were two things that played to the advantage of Israel. One of them was that in September of 2007, the Israeli Air Force, under orders of the government at that time, destroyed the Syrian nuclear facility in the east of Syria, which was very close to become operational. In one of the great achievements of the Israeli intelligence on the one hand and the Israeli Air Force on the other hand. Just imagine at the time of collapse in Syria when this site would have been operational and falling to the hands of Islamic jihadists, ISIS or whoever else. And then, of course, it was a very great achievement. The other fact is that despite all the peace talks that took place between different Israeli governments in Syria, there was no Israeli withdrawal from the Golan Heights, which after 2011 was recognized by the vast majority of Israel to be like almost a political miracle, because under the circumstances of the Syrian civil war, no one in Israel even figured out, or very few, that there could be a situation whereby Islamic rebels, jihadists of one kind or another, pro-Iran or whatever else, will be in control of the Golan Heights overlooking the northern part of Israel. Now, yet the Israeli policy was, we are not interfering in the Syrian civil war. There are quite a few reasons for that. And one of them, which is very important, and I would like to emphasize this particular one, is the so-called Lebanese syndrome. The Lebanese quagmire of Israel being in Lebanon from 1982 to 2000, involving itself in a civil war between warring factions, and all that happened there was very significant factor for Israeli policymakers. Let's not repeat the same mistake about Syria. However, there were limits being set. And one of them is the situation on the other side of the Golan Heights, what was the Syrian side, particularly with regard to the Druze community there. Israel had a commitment and still has and will have a commitment, to defend the Druze population of South Syria, about 700,000 people. We'll talk more about that already in the next chapter of this series that will be about the future Israel-Syria situation. We'll get into more details about that. So the only real actual intervention of Israel was about that. Later on, in 2013, 2014, Israel started what they call the low-intensity war. In a way, in coordination with Russia that was there, in order to prevent Iran from using Syrian territory to supply arms to Hezbollah in Lebanon. The low-intensity war reflected Israeli military aerial superiority, the inability of the Syrian army to really deal with it, despite all the air defense systems which they had from Russia. It also reflected something else interesting, and this is the fact that Russia, despite its being present in Syria in support of Bashar Assad, did not really try to prevent Israel from doing what Israel did against the Iranians. It was a common interest of the two parties because the Russians did not want the Iranians to be the rivals over influence in Syria once the civil war is over. That, by the way, the cooperation with Russia in Syria was one of the reasons, not the only one, but one of the reasons why Israel maintained its position of kind of neutrality, if you will, in the war between Russia and Ukraine. Because the consideration was the interests with Russia in Syria were so important that we need to be, as Israel, needs to be careful about Ukraine, which is an interesting point. I will get more into aspects of the Israel-Syria situation in the immediate future or in the medium-term future in our next episode, which will be on Friday only, because in the meantime there is Hanukkah, and happy Hanukkah for those who celebrate this great Jewish national holiday festival, and Merry Christmas for those who celebrate this Christian Festival. And thank you all for your attention. We'll meet again on Friday.